The soldiers in the BTRs had not yet reached the front. They were fresh, rotated from rest positions, fed, rested to a degree that soldiers at the forward edge had not been for days or weeks. They were the reinforcement that the exhausted Russian units holding forward positions in eastern Ukraine had been waiting for. The rotation that would relieve soldiers who had been holding without adequate rest, replenish the combat power that attrition had been reducing, and restore a level of operational effectiveness to positions that were degrading because the people holding them were running out of the physical and psychological reserves that sustained combat requires. They never arrived. Ukrainian thermal imaging drone operators found the BTR-82A column in the early hours of a May night. Engine heat visible against the cooling ground, the column moving through the darkness, along the route that Ukrainian intelligence had assessed as the most probable approach for a Russian night rotation. The column had chosen night movement specifically to reduce Ukrainian observation and engagement. The darkness that was supposed to protect it did nothing against thermal imaging that sees engine heat as clearly as daylight sees vehicle silhouettes. FPV teams, pre-positioned along the assessed route, had been waiting since before midnight. What happened over the following 22 minutes was the destruction of a Russian rotation mission that had been planned to solve an operational problem: the degradation of Russian combat units through sustained operations without adequate rest. And that instead became the destruction of the solution itself, killing or wounding the fresh soldiers, who were supposed to relieve the exhausted ones, and leaving the forward units to continue in the condition they had been in. This is that story. And this is what Russia paid for a rotation that never completed. The operational problem that the rotation was intended to address is worth examining because it reveals a dimension of military effectiveness that is less visible than the dramatic engagement losses, but that is equally consequential for the outcome of the conflict. Russian forward units in eastern Ukraine have been conducting sustained combat operations under conditions of significant stress. The physical demands of maintaining forward positions, standing security rotations, responding to Ukrainian fires and probes, conducting the maintenance and logistics activities that kept positions supplied, have been ongoing for extended periods with limited rest. The psychological demands, the constant awareness of observation by Ukrainian drones, the anticipation of incoming fires, the close proximity threat that forward positions in an active combat zone require constant management, are in many ways more debilitating than the physical demands over time. Military doctrine across all professional armies establishes that combat units require periodic rest and recovery to maintain effective operational capability. The specific timelines vary by doctrine and by conditions, but the underlying principle is universal. Soldiers who are not rested, who have been under sustained stress without relief, become progressively less effective. Their reaction times slow. Their decision quality degrades. Their physical endurance is reduced. Their resistance to the psychological effects of sustained combat diminishes. Units that have been in contact without adequate rest eventually reach the point where they are holding positions more by the absence of their own collapse than by the presence of effective military capability. Russian commanders ordering the rotation were attempting to address exactly this problem. The fresh units in the BTRs were supposed to relieve forward units that were approaching or past the threshold of effective sustained operations. The relief would allow the exhausted units to withdraw to rest positions, recover, and eventually return to the rotation. The cycle of relief and rest is the operational mechanism that professional armies use to sustain combat power over extended periods. Ukrainian forces targeting the rotation were not simply trying to destroy BTRs. They were targeting the operational mechanism that allowed Russian forces to maintain sustained combat capability in the sector. Disrupting the rotation, destroying the fresh units before they arrived, leaving the exhausted forward units in their positions imposes a compound operational cost. The direct loss of the soldiers in the BTRs and the continued degradation of the forward units that did not receive the relief they were expecting. The intelligence that allowed Ukrainian forces to anticipate the rotation had been building over several days. Ukrainian analysts, monitoring Russian logistics and personnel movement in the sector, had observed the patterns that precede a rotation operation. The movement of personnel from rest positions toward the assembly area, the increased communications traffic associated with rotation coordination, the repositioning of BTRs toward the assembly point that would load the rotation force. The pattern was familiar. Ukrainian intelligence had observed Russian rotation operations in the sector before and had developed the analytical signatures that distinguish rotation preparation from other personnel movement. The likely route was assessed from the road network, the terrain, and the historical patterns of Russian vehicle movement in the sector. Night rotations use routes that provide the best combination of speed, road quality, and concealment from Ukrainian observation positions. Constraints that narrow the options in eastern Ukrainian terrain to a limited number of practical routes. Ukrainian analysts identified the most probable route, and FPV teams were positioned along it before the rotation column began to move. The thermal imaging drone that acquired the column found it exactly where assessment predicted, on the most probable route, moving at the pace of a BTR column in transit, the thermal signatures of the vehicle's engines standing out clearly against the early May ground temperature. The column was identified, counted, and its position reported to the FPV teams in approximately 4 minutes from initial detection. 6 BTR-82As, one command vehicle, moving at approximately 40 kilometers per hour on a road that would bring them to the assault FPV team's engagement range within minutes. The engagement plan was specific. The leading BTR and the trailing BTR were the priority targets for simultaneous engagement, sealing the column at both ends before the middle vehicles could accelerate or reverse out of the engagement zone. The command vehicle, identifiable by its antenna configuration, was the third priority, its destruction removing the coordination capability that might allow surviving vehicles to organize a response. The middle vehicles would be engaged in sequence once the column was sealed. The choke point that the route passed through, a section where the road crossed a narrow bridge over a drainage canal, compressing the column's dispersal and reducing the road width to a single vehicle lane, was the designated engagement trigger. A column crossing a narrow bridge cannot disperse. It cannot leave the road surface. It is, for the seconds required to complete the crossing, exactly as concentrated and exactly as constrained as a target can be. The lead BTR reached the bridge. The first FPV drone launched. The strike hit the lead BTR in the engine compartment, disabling the vehicle in the bridge lane. The bridge was blocked. Behind the lead BTR, the following vehicles decelerated as their commanders assessed the blocked route ahead. The second FPV drone struck the trailing BTR on the approach to the bridge, the vehicle that was last in column and whose destruction prevented reversal. The column was sealed. 4 BTRs and the command vehicle were now stopped on a road leading to a blocked bridge with impassable drainage canal on both sides. 3 more FPV drones engaged the vehicles in sequence. The command vehicle, struck in its antenna assembly and then in its hull by a follow-on engagement, lost communications capability before its crew could report the full extent of what was happening. The middle BTRs stopped on the road with no exit, absorbed the subsequent strikes as their crews attempted to dismount and move away from the vehicles. The dismounting crews had no covered ground to move to. The road they were on ran through open agricultural terrain, flat, unobstructed, visible in the thermal imaging of the Overwatch drone that was maintaining observation. Ukrainian FPV teams continued to engage until all vehicles were stopped, and the crew movement in the open ground around them had ceased. 22 minutes, 6 BTRs and the command vehicle destroyed or disabled. The rotation column was gone. The Russian forward units waiting for relief in their positions were informed at some point in the following hours that the rotation had failed. How that information was communicated and what it did to the morale and the operational thinking of soldiers who had been enduring their positions with the expectation of relief. This is not knowable from the outside, but the operational consequence is clear. Units that expected relief and did not receive it continue to hold in the condition they were in, without the recovery that the rotation would have provided. Now let us examine what Russia lost. The BTR-82A infantry fighting vehicle carries a replacement cost of approximately $1.2 to $1.8 million USD per unit under current Russian procurement conditions. 6 BTR-82As destroyed or disabled beyond recovery. $7.2 to $10.8 million in vehicle replacement costs. The command vehicle, $1.5 to $2 million. Total vehicle losses, $8.7 to $12.8 million. The personnel losses are the more significant cost in operational terms. The soldiers in the BTRs were not combat-degraded frontline infantry. They were fresh troops, rested, supplied, physically and psychologically prepared for the rotation they were conducting. In a conflict where Russian manpower is under documented pressure, and where the quality and readiness of available infantry is a persistent operational constraint, fresh soldiers have a higher immediate military value than exhausted ones. Losing them before they reach their positions means the loss is compounded. The direct loss of fresh soldiers, plus the continued degradation of the exhausted soldiers who did not receive relief. Conservative personnel cost estimate accounting for training investment and operational value of the fresh versus exhausted replacement comparison. $2 to $4 million in direct personnel cost, plus an operational effectiveness multiplier for the continued degradation of the unreinforced forward units that is difficult to quantify but real and immediate. The ammunition and equipment in the BTRs, the rotation forces weapons, ammunition load, and personal equipment adds $500,000 to $1 million in materiel losses. Total direct cost of the engagement, $11.2 to $17.8 million USD. For soldiers who never reached the positions they were going to hold. Ukrainian thermal imaging drone operators found a column that chose night movement as its protection. Ukrainian FPV teams had been waiting on the route before the column began to move. 22 minutes from the first strike to the last. 6 BTRs gone. The rotation failed, the forward units held without relief. Ukraine finds what moves in the dark with thermal eyes that see as clearly at night as in the day. Ukraine strikes the rotation that was supposed to restore Russian combat power. Ukraine holds the front against units that are more exhausted today than they were yesterday because the soldiers who were supposed to relieve them never arrived. The BTRs are gone. The fresh soldiers are gone. The exhausted Russian units at the forward edge face another day without the relief that was supposed to come. Ukraine does not allow Russian forces to rest and restore. Ukraine strikes the rotation. Ukraine holds against the force that cannot recover. The night in eastern Ukraine belongs to Ukrainian thermal imaging and Ukrainian FPV operators. Russian forces that move in the dark find that the dark is not their protection. It never was. Ukraine holds the night. Ukraine holds the front. And the rotation that was supposed to change the combat balance in the sector changed nothing except the location where Russia's losses were counted. To understand the full operational significance of this engagement, it is necessary to examine the specific relationship between unit rotation and sustained combat effectiveness, and why targeting the rotation mechanism is one of the highest leverage operations that Ukrainian forces can conduct. The degradation of combat units through sustained operations without adequate rest is not a linear process. Units do not become progressively and smoothly less effective at a constant rate. They degrade in ways that can appear manageable for extended periods and then deteriorate rapidly once key thresholds are passed. The threshold at which a unit's effectiveness drops sharply, when sleep deprivation reaches levels that impair judgment, when accumulated stress reaches levels that impair emotional regulation, when physical exhaustion reaches levels that impair reaction time and physical performance, is the point at which a unit that appeared to be holding becomes a unit that is at risk of failing under pressure it might have managed a week earlier. Russian forward units in eastern Ukraine that have been holding positions without adequate rotation are approaching or past those thresholds in varying degrees. Ukrainian intelligence, which monitors the operational behavior and communications patterns of Russian forward units, can in some cases identify the indicators of unit degradation, reduced activity levels, increased errors in communications procedures, the specific communication patterns that suggest commanders managing soldiers who are past their optimal operational state. A unit whose indicators suggest degradation is a unit where Ukrainian pressure may find a vulnerability that the same pressure would not have found a week earlier. The rotation that Russian commanders ordered was intended to reset those indicators, to replace the degraded units with fresh ones whose thresholds had not been reached, giving the degraded units time to recover, and the frontline functional defenders who could manage the operational environment effectively. Ukrainian forces who destroyed the rotation were not simply removing combat power from the Russian order of battle. They were preventing the reset, ensuring that the degraded forward units continue to hold in their degraded state rather than being relieved and replaced by fresh capability. The compound effect of this, the direct loss of the fresh soldiers, plus the continued degradation of the unreplaced forward units, represents an operational gain that extends beyond the immediate engagement. This is the specific logic of attriting rotation forces rather than simply engaging forward units directly. A forward unit that is degraded but still holding is, in many ways, a more useful target than a fresh unit arriving to relieve it. Because destroying the fresh replacement means the degraded unit continues to hold in its current state, while destroying the degraded unit allows its replacement to reset the tactical capability at the position. Ukrainian targeting of the rotation addresses the mechanism by which Russia attempts to sustain its forward capability, rather than simply the capability itself. The thermal imaging technology that detected the column is worth specific examination because it represents a capability asymmetry that has become increasingly important as the conflict has extended into the hours of darkness. Early in the conflict, Russian forces exploited night movement as a meaningful form of protection against Ukrainian observation. Ukrainian ground-based observation has limited night capability without specialized equipment, and the darkness that covers movement from unaided human eyes provides genuine concealment. The expansion of Ukrainian drone operations with thermal imaging has progressively eliminated that protection. Thermal imaging detects the heat differential between a vehicle's engine and exhaust system and the ambient temperature of the surrounding environment, a differential that is actually larger at night in early May conditions, when the ground temperature drops after sunset and creates a more pronounced contrast against the heat sources that operational vehicles generate. A BTR-82A moving along a road in the early hours of a May morning produces a thermal signature that is clearer against the cooled ground than it would be at midday when the ambient temperature reduces the contrast. Russian commanders who ordered the night rotation were working from an assessment of observation risk that the Ukrainian thermal imaging capability has made outdated. The darkness they were counting on for protection was irrelevant to the thermal imaging drone that found them within 4 minutes of their movement beginning. And the response time, from initial thermal detection to FPV teams receiving the engagement order, was compressed by the pre-positioning of FPV assets along the assessed route, which meant the engagement preparation was already complete when the column was found. This is the operational consequence of Ukrainian intelligence anticipating the rotation and pre-positioning assets before it began. If FPV teams had been positioned reactively after the column was detected, the window between detection and engagement would have required moving teams into position, a process that adds time and reduces the probability of intercepting the column before it reached its destination. Pre-positioning based on intelligence prediction closed that window entirely. The column moved into an engagement that was already prepared for it. Russian military planners will adapt. They will attempt to create deception about rotation timing and routes, sending false movement signals to confuse Ukrainian collection. They will attempt to use electronic countermeasures against thermal drone systems. They will reduce the predictability of rotation patterns to make pre-positioning more difficult. Each of these adaptations is real, and some of them will partially succeed, but each adaptation also has costs. Deception operations add planning complexity and coordination overhead to logistics operations that Russian commanders are already managing under strain. Electronic countermeasures against thermal imaging are technically more difficult than countermeasures against radio frequency drone guidance because thermal imaging is a passive sensor. It emits nothing that can be jammed, only detecting the heat that vehicles cannot avoid generating. Reduced predictability in rotation patterns means more coordination effort for the same logistical function, reducing the efficiency of the rotation system that Russian combat power depends on. Every adaptation that Russian logistics planners make to protect their rotation operations from Ukrainian targeting adds friction to the system, while Ukrainian forces continue to develop their prediction and interception capabilities. The competition is ongoing, but it is ongoing from a starting point where Ukraine demonstrated on a May night in eastern Ukraine that a Russian night rotation column moving to relieve exhausted frontline units was found, tracked, engaged, and destroyed in 22 minutes. Before a single fresh soldier it was carrying reached the position they were supposed to hold. The exhausted Russian units at the forward edge of eastern Ukraine are still holding without the relief that was coming for them. They will hold in the condition they have been in, without the physical recovery and the psychological reset that rotation provides for as long as Russian commanders take to organize and execute another attempt. Ukrainian forces will be watching the next attempt. They will be studying the route, pre-positioning the assets, waiting in the darkness with thermal eyes that see everything that moves. The night rotation failed. The fresh soldiers are gone. The front is held by Ukrainian forces against Russian units that are more worn than they were before the column moved. Ukraine sees in the dark. Ukraine strikes what moves in it. Ukraine holds the line against the force that cannot rest. The Eastern Front in early May is held by Ukrainian defenders, facing Russian units that cannot recover because Ukraine will not let them. That is the front, that is Ukraine, holding. There is one final element of this engagement that belongs in the record. The element that connects the thermal imaging drone, the FPV teams, and the 22 minutes of the engagement to the Ukrainian soldiers whose operational environment improved because the rotation never arrived. The Ukrainian defenders facing the Russian forward units that did not receive their rotation will not see an immediate dramatic change in the threat they face. The exhausted Russian soldiers holding their positions will still be holding them. The fires that have been coming in will still come. The assault attempts will still be attempted, but exhausted soldiers make different decisions than rested ones. Their timing is slower. Their fire discipline is less precise. Their ability to manage multiple simultaneous threats is reduced. Their judgment under pressure, the quality of their tactical decisions at the moments that matter, is degraded by the accumulated weight of days without adequate rest. Ukrainian defenders facing those soldiers will notice gradually that the pressure they are under is less coherent than it was, that the timing of assaults is slightly off, that the fire support coordination is slightly less responsive, that the small degradations are accumulating in ways that make each individual day of holding slightly less costly than it would have been if the rotation had succeeded. They will not know why. They will hold. And the Ukrainian FPV operators who destroyed the rotation will have contributed to that holding invisibly, from a road several kilometers back, 22 minutes on a May night that most of the beneficiaries will never hear about. Ukraine holds the night. Ukraine holds the front. And the rotation that failed to arrive is one reason the front is still Ukrainian.